The scoring algorithm had a fail-safe built into it. Nobody was supposed to know that. I know it because I wrote part of it. My name is Instructor Senek Vosh, third-rank weapons faculty at the Kelvax Joint Defense Academy. And for 11 cycles, I have overseen the marksmanship evaluation for every non-Kelvaxi cadet who passes through our doors. I want to tell you about the day I broke my own exam to protect a human, and how she broke it right back in a way that I am still trying to explain to my superiors. Let me set the scene properly, because context matters here. The Kelvax Joint Defense Academy sits on a ring station above the fourth moon of Ortith Prime, and it exists for one purpose: to train officers from all 17 member species of the Coalition to fight side by side without getting each other killed. It is old, it is respected, and it is, if I am being honest with you, deeply arrogant about its own standards. We do not fail cadets gently here. In this, we fail them publicly on a live range in front of their squad so that the lesson costs something. 2 months before the day I am telling you about, we received our newest intake, 14 cadets. 13 of them were exactly what you would expect. A pair of broad-shouldered Thren with their forearms and their reflexive aggression, a trio of Affinari with their compound eyes and their infuriating calm, some SSK-Tel with skin like wet stone, a couple of Vantu who complained about the gravity constantly and were in fairness correct too. Standard mix, standard training. The 14th cadet was human. Her name was Cadet Rosalinda Chaby, and I remember the exact moment I saw her file because I laughed, not cruelly. It was just funny. Her physical stats were, by every metric the Coalition uses to evaluate combat aptitude, unremarkable. Height, average. Grip, strength, average. Reaction time on the standardized cognitive battery, average, maybe even a little below average, which surprised me at the time, and which I now understand had nothing to do with her actual reflexes and everything to do with a test being designed for species whose nervous systems work nothing like a human's. Here is the thing you need to understand about how the Coalition classifies Earth, because it explains everything that happened afterward. Earth is filed in our registry as a Class 3 temperate biosphere, mild seasonal variance, moderate gravity. No apex predator, conflicts of note in recorded history. It is, on paper, one of the gentlest garden worlds in the surveyed galaxy. A world where nothing in particular should have needed to get good at killing quickly. I want you to sit with how wrong that classification is, because I certainly did not understand it yet. Not when Rosalinda Chaby first stepped onto my range. She was quiet. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Not sullen, not nervous, just economical with her words. In a way that some of the more talkative species found unsettling. The Thren cadets, Gorham and Dessa, decided within the first week that this quietness meant weakness, and they treated her the way young aggressive males of most species treat something they've decided is beneath their notice, with a kind of casual, performative contempt. They didn't bully her exactly, they just never expected anything from her, out loud in front of others, repeatedly, until it became the room's default assumption. I'll admit, I fell into the same pattern. It's a professional failing, and I own it. When you've spent 11 cycles watching hundreds of cadets from every corner of the Coalition pass through your range, you build instincts. And my instincts, calibrated on a Class 3 Garden World rating, told me that this human was going to need help. Extra range time, adjusted expectations, maybe a modified curriculum, the kind we sometimes build for cadets from lower gravity worlds whose bone density can't handle standard equipment loads. So when the marksmanship final approached, I did something I am not proud of, and something that is, technically, against every regulation this academy claims to uphold. I rigged it. Let me explain what that actually means, because rig makes it sound more dramatic than the mundane, bureaucratic cowardice it actually was. The standard final exam for marksmanship consists of 12 targets, arranged across a 200-meter range, moving on randomized tracks at randomized intervals, appearing and vanishing behind cover at irregular timing designed to simulate combat chaos. The cadet is scored on hits, time, and target discrimination, meaning, did you shoot the 12 hostiles and not the 4 civilian silhouettes mixed in among them? It is a hard exam, Cadets fail it. Good cadets fail it the first time. What I did 3 days before Rosalind's evaluation slot was quietly instruct the range technician to widen her acceptable hit windows, slow her target cycling speed by 30%, and pad the timing buffer so that even a mediocre performance would read as a passing score. I told myself I was being kind. I told myself I was protecting a fragile cadet from a humiliating public failure that would follow her through the rest of her career. Because on a station where reputation moves at the speed of gossip, a bad showing on the range gets remembered for years. I did not ask her if she wanted protecting. That's the part that still embarrasses me most. Looking back, I made a decision about a person's capability based on a species classification and a quiet demeanor, and I never once thought to simply ask her how she felt about the exam. Instructors love to talk about individualized assessment. We are, apparently, not very good at practicing what we preach. The morning of the final arrived, and the observation gallery above the range was fuller than usual because word had gotten around, as it does, that the human cadets exam had been adjusted. I don't know how the cadets found out. Cadets always find out. Gorham and Dessa were up there, smirking. A cluster of Ophanari observers had come to watch with their characteristic detached curiosity. Commandant Threll herself, an old and decorated Vantu officer, who had fought in 3 border conflicts, had wandered in with a cup of something steaming, more out of habit than expectation. Rosalind walked onto the range floor in her gray training, fatigues, rifle slung, and stopped at the firing line. She looked up at the gallery for a long moment. I remember thinking she looked tired. I understand now that she was not tired. She was doing arithmetic. Then she turned to me, standing at the control podium, and she asked a question that I have replayed in my head more times than I can count. "Instructor Vosh," she said, "is the exam calibrated for me or calibrated to make me look acceptable?" I did not have a good answer. I fumbled something about standardized accommodations for physiological variance, and she let me finish, which in hindsight was its own kind of mercy, because she clearly already knew exactly what I'd done and was simply giving me the chance to be honest about it before she took the floor away from me entirely. "I'd like the standard exam parameters restored," she said. "Full speed, full randomization, no timing buffer." There was a ripple of noise from the gallery. Gorham laughed outright. I told her, genuinely trying to help, I want that on the record, that the standard parameters were difficult even for cadets with significantly enhanced reflex profiles. That, failing the full exam publicly would go into her permanent record, that there was no shame in taking the accommodation. "There's no shame in trying either," she said. "I'd rather fail honestly than pass a test that was never actually testing me." I looked at Commandant Threll, hoping she'd overrule the request and let me quietly preserve my own comfortable assumptions. Instead, the Commandant set down her drink, walked to the railing, and said, in that flat Vantu way that always sounds more like a verdict than a suggestion, "Restore the parameters, instructor. Let the cadet be evaluated." So I did. I keyed in the standard profile, full target speed, full randomization, the tight discrimination windows that fail cadets for even a half-second's hesitation between a hostile silhouette and a civilian one. My hands, I'll admit, were not entirely steady doing it, because some small unprofessional part of me was now afraid I just signed up to watch someone get humiliated in front of the entire gallery because I'd pushed her into defending her pride. And then Rosalind Achebe did something that made the entire control room go silent before she'd even fired a shot. She reached into her kit, pulled out a length of black cloth and tied it over her eyes. I actually said something aloud. I don't remember what. Some kind of objection, probably reflexive. The kind of noise you make when you watch someone step toward the edge of a platform. Dessa up in the gallery said something I won't repeat, something about human cadets having a death wish, and a couple of the Ophanari observers actually stood up, their compound eyes doing that faint, shimmering thing they do when they're startled. Rosalind adjusted the blindfold, tightened it, and then said calmly to no one in particular, "Ready when the range is." I want to explain something to you now, because at the time I did not understand it, and I think you deserve to understand it before I tell you what happened next, because otherwise it will sound like magic. And it wasn't magic. It was biology. It was geology. It was In the most literal sense, the reason Earth's coalition classification has been quietly flagged for review 3 separate times by 3 separate committees and quietly buried 3 separate times by bureaucrats who did not want to admit their registry had been catastrophically wrong for over a century. Earth is not a Class 3 garden world. I need to say that plainly, because the euphemism has done a great deal of damage to how the galaxy understands humans, and I include myself in the list of people who were damaged by it. Earth has an axial tilt that produces violent seasonal extremes. Across most of its landmass, it has tectonic activity that regularly reshapes its coastlines. It has a moon disproportionately large for a planet, its size dragging brutal tidal forces across its oceans twice a day. It has weather systems, hurricanes, typhoons, blizzards, tornadoes, that would qualify as planetary emergencies on most coalition worlds, and that humans simply built houses to survive and then went back outside. Its history includes ice ages that nearly extinguished the species entirely, and it is populated even now by predators that can kill a human in seconds. Big cats, bears, venomous things in the water, venomous things in the grass, venomous things that live in the walls of their own homes in certain regions, apparently, which is a detail I did not believe until I confirmed it independently. And the thing about a species that evolves under those conditions is that it does not develop the fine, elegant, sensory specializations of a species that evolves in comfort. It develops redundancy. It develops instinct stacked on instinct, backup systems layered over backup systems, until the nervous system stops depending on any single channel of information to keep the organism alive. Human hearing, it turns out, is extraordinary in ways their own species barely talks about, because to them it is simply ordinary. They can localize a sound to within a few degrees of arc using nothing but the microsecond delay between their 2 ears. Their proprioception, their internal sense of exactly where every part of their body is in space, without looking, is dense and precise, refined over millions of years by ancestors who could not afford to misjudge a branch, a ledge, a step in the dark. And their motor learning, once a skill is trained deeply enough, moves out of conscious processing entirely and into something closer to reflex, something that operates faster than the parts of the brain that would normally have to see a target, recognize it, and decide to shoot. I did not know any of this with real clarity that morning. I knew fragments of it, academy trivia, the kind of thing you hear in a lecture once, and forget. What I knew, standing at that podium with my hand hovering over the range activation control, was that I was about to watch a blindfolded cadet attempt an exam that broke sighted cadets from 6 other species on a regular basis, and I felt, very distinctly, like I had failed her twice in 1 week. The range lights dimmed to the standard evaluation setting. The gallery had gone almost completely silent. That specific silence you get when a room full of people are all quietly hoping they are not about to watch something terrible happen. I gave the activation command. The first target rose from cover at the 80-meter mark, a hostile silhouette on a lateral track, moving fast, the kind of appearance-to-disappearance window that gives a trained cadet perhaps 3/4 of a second to acquire, aim, and fire before it drops back into cover. Rosalind fired before I had even consciously registered the target rising. The round took it dead center. I remember my exact thought because I've replayed it so many times it's practically etched into me that has to be luck. Nobody tracks an unseen target on a lateral vector and puts a round through its center mass on the first shot. It has to be luck, or she's not actually blindfolded, or the cloth is thin enough to see shapes through. Or the second target rose, 40 meters further down the range, on a completely different track vector, appearing for even less time than the first. She hit it before the echo of the first shot had finished rolling off the range walls. By the third target, the gallery had stopped making any noise at all. By the fifth, Commandant Thrall had leaned forward over the railing with both hands gripping the metal so hard I could hear the faint creak of Vantu tendon strength testing the bar. By the seventh target, a civilian discrimination silhouette deliberately placed among the hostiles, the exact kind of target that trips up cadets who are firing on pure reflex without real target awareness. Rosalind's rifle did not fire at all. She held. Half a second passed, an eternity in exam time, and then the 8th target rose and she put a round through it without hesitation, having somehow blindfolded mid-string, discriminated between a hostile and a civilian silhouette using nothing but the sound and displacement signature of the target mechanism itself. I want to be very clear about what that means, because it is the detail that changed how I understood this entire species. Anyone can get lucky on a moving target. Once, twice, maybe even 3 times, if the universe is feeling generous and the tracks happen to be simple. What you cannot fake, what pure luck cannot produce, is correctly identifying which target not to shoot, blind, under time pressure, based on subtle differences in the mechanical sound of a hostile rig versus a civilian rig. A difference so small that our own sensor engineers use calibrated microphones to detect it during range maintenance. She was not guessing. She was listening to the machinery of my own exam more carefully than I had listened to it in 11 cycles of running it. The 9th target went down. The 10th. By the 11th, several of the Elfinary observers in the gallery had extended their secondary eyelids fully, which for their species is roughly the equivalent of a human's jaw actually hitting the floor, an expression of pure, involuntary shock. Gorham, the Thren cadet who had laughed loudest an hour earlier, had gone completely rigid, his upper set of arms frozen mid-gesture from whatever mocking comment he'd been about to make to Dessa. The 12th target rose at the far end of the range, 200 meters out, on the fastest track profile the exam software generates, reserved specifically for the final target, because by that point in the standard exam, most cadets are rattled, tired, and prone to rushing the shot. Rosalind Akeb did not rush. She took, by the range chronometer's own log, 0.4 of a second longer on that final shot than on any of the previous 11. And then she fired, and the round went through the target's designated kill zone, with a margin so tight the impact sensor flagged it for manual verification, because the automated system initially logged it as a possible malfunction rather than believe a human hand had placed a shot that precisely, at that range, blind. At the tail end of a 12-target string, the whole sequence, from first shot to last, took 5.8 seconds. I checked that number 4 times before I believed it. I am checking it again now, telling you this because some part of me still wants it to be wrong, because a number like that rewrites things you thought you understood about how fast a biological nervous system is allowed to move. Range went silent for a solid 10 seconds after the 12th target dropped. Nobody in the gallery spoke. I didn't speak. Even the range's ambient systems seemed to have gone quiet, though of course that was just my perception. Adrenaline doing what adrenaline does to a person's sense of the world around them. Rosalind reached up, pulled the blindfold off, and blinked a few times against the range lighting. She looked at the downed targets, all 12 of them, the 4 civilian silhouettes standing untouched among the wreckage of the hostiles, and then she looked up at the gallery. And then, finally, at me. "Did that satisfy the standard parameters, instructor?" she asked. I did not have words for a moment. I want to be honest with you about that because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I have stood on that range for 11 cycles. I have watched cadets from species with echolocation, with compound vision, with reflex-augmenting neural implants that the Coalition only grudgingly permits under strict oversight, and none of them, not one, had ever put together a clean run like that, with their eyes open, let alone closed. It exceeded them, I finally managed. Considerably. Commandant Threll came down from the gallery herself, which she almost never does, and walked the length of the range to stand in front of Rosalind. The Commandant is a formidable presence even by Vantu standards, nearly 7 feet of dense muscle built for a homeworld, with gravity 40% higher than baseline. And she has a habit of looking at people the way a geologist looks at an interesting rock formation, assessing, cataloging, rarely impressed. She was, in that moment, plainly impressed. "Cadet," she said, "explain to me how you did that." And here is the part of the story that I think matters more than the shooting itself, because the shooting, spectacular as it was, is not actually the most important thing that happened on that range that day. What mattered was what Rosalind said next, because it recontextualized everything. "I didn't need my eyes," she said. I needed to trust what my ears and my body already knew and get my eyes out of the way so they'd stop second-guessing it. Threll tilted her head, the Vantu equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Explain. Rosalind considered the question for a moment the way someone does when they're trying to translate an instinct they've never had to articulate before into language another species will actually understand. Where I'm from. She said, there's a saying. Analysis. Paralysis. It's what happens when you have too much information and not enough time to use it properly. So your brain tries to process everything and ends up processing nothing fast enough to matter. With the blindfold off, part of my brain is trying to visually track 12 moving targets, cross-reference each one against threat criteria, calculate a firing solution, and second-guess all of it in real time. That's slow. That's the bottleneck. Take the eyes out of it, and the rest of the system just runs. I could hear the track motors, I could hear the air displacement off each silhouette as it rose. The hostile rigs and the civilian rigs use different servo housings. The civilian ones are quieter, lower torque, because they're not built to snap back into cover as fast. Once you know that, you don't need to see them at all. I remember Threll looking at her for a long moment, before asking the question that, honestly, all of us in that room wanted answered. Where you're from, the Commandant said slowly. Civilians and combatants regularly move at speeds requiring that kind of discrimination. Rosalind actually smiled slightly at that, the first real expression I think I'd seen from her in 2 months. No, she said. Where I'm from, you learn to trust your other senses because your eyes lie to you constantly, and get you killed if you rely on them alone. Fog, darkness, water, smoke. Every environment on Earth has some way of making vision useless. And every animal on Earth that's ever hunted a human or been hunted by one has figured out how to exploit that. So you learn. Or your ancestors didn't, and you're not here to learn it. There was a long silence after that. I want to describe it accurately because it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the silence of an entire room quietly rearranging a category in their heads. I think this is the moment where I should step back from the range floor for a second and tell you something about my own species, because I think it explains why this hit us as hard as it did. The Kelvax evolved on a moderate world, mild seasons, few apex predators, and our entire evaluative framework as an academy is built on the assumption that combat capability scales predictably with physical stats. Strength, reach, reaction time on a controlled cognitive test. We build our exams around that assumption. We calibrate our accommodations around that assumption. When a cadet's baseline stats read as average, we assume their combat ceiling is average, and we adjust our expectations. And sometimes, as I did, we quietly adjust the test itself to spare someone a failure we've already decided is inevitable. What none of us accounted for is that a species can look average on every metric we know how to measure, and still be carrying, underneath that average profile, a nervous system forged by conditions so much more hostile than our own baseline, that our entire measuring system simply doesn't have the right instruments. Earth's Class 3 rating isn't wrong because someone lied on the paperwork. It's wrong because the Coalition's classification criteria were built by species who evolved in comfort, trying to quantify a world that never once let its inhabitants relax, and the numbers simply don't have a box for that. After the exam, word spread across the station faster than I could have controlled even if I'd wanted to, which I didn't, because frankly I thought people deserved to know. By the following day, cadets from 3 other squads had come to watch the range recording. By the end of the week, a training officer from a completely different division had requested a formal debrief because, apparently, there was already talk of revising the standard reflex assessment curriculum to include an auditory discrimination component modeled loosely on what Rosalind had done instinctively. Gorum and Dessa, the 2 Thran cadets who'd spent 2 months treating her with casual contempt, handled it about as gracefully as you'd expect, which is to say, not very. Dessa avoided her for almost a week, which on a station this size, with a cadet class this small, takes real effort. Gorum, to his credit, eventually did something that actually raised my opinion of him. He found her in the mess hall and asked bluntly in that direct threat manner whether she'd be willing to run a training session with him on threat discrimination by sound cues. Because he'd apparently gone back and watched the range footage a dozen times and couldn't stop thinking about the seventh target. The one she hadn't fired on, she said yes. No lecture, no pointed comment about his prior behavior, nothing that would have been entirely justified given how he'd treated her for 2 months. She just said yes, and showed up and taught him what she could, which honestly says as much about her character as the shooting did. I want to tell you about my own conversation with her because I think I owe you the honest version of it, not a flattering one. I found her a few days after the exam in one of the equipment rooms off the main range, cleaning her kit with the kind of unhurried, methodical care that I'd noticed was characteristic of her in everything she did. I sat down across from her, and I apologized. I told her plainly that I had made a judgment about her capability based on a classification sheet and a quiet manner, and that I had been wrong, and that beyond being wrong, I had taken away her right to be evaluated honestly, which was a worse failure than simply misjudging her. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which I've since learned is very characteristic of humans in serious conversations, a kind of patience that a lot of species find unnerving, because it gives you nowhere to hide from your own words. When I finished, she said something I've thought about many times since. "You're not wrong that most people take one look at my file and assume I'm the fragile one in the room," she said. "Honestly, instructor, I understand why. Your registry says Earth is soft. Most of the galaxies never had a reason to check that assumption, because nobody's had to fight us to find out otherwise, and we're not exactly advertising it. But I'd rather you underestimate me, and let me prove you wrong, than protect me from a fair fight, because you already decided I'd lose it. The second one's worse. The second one means you never actually see me at all." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else that happened that day. More even than the shooting itself, because it names something that I think a lot of institutions, mine very much included, get quietly wrong about kindness. We tell ourselves that lowering the bar for someone is compassion. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just another, gentler-looking form of the same dismissal, dressed up so it doesn't feel like an insult, and the people on the receiving end of it know the difference even when we pretend not to. Rosalind Achibe finished the Academy's 2-year program 11 months later at the top of her class, not because she outscored every other cadet on every metric. She didn't. The Ophanari cadets in particular had an edge in strategic simulation work that she readily admitted she couldn't match, but because the marksmanship record she set that day on the range has, as of the last time I checked the registry, never been beaten by any cadet of any species in this Academy's 41-cycle history. Full randomization, full speed, blindfolded, 5.8 seconds, 12 for 12. 0 civilian casualties. The record still has an asterisk next to it in the official logs, a little administrative footnote, because apparently someone in the records office genuinely could not process that the number was accurate and insisted on flagging it for a permanent verification note, as though at any moment someone might come forward and prove it had been a clerical error. It has not been proven a clerical error. It will not be. I've watched the footage more times than I'd like to admit, and I still catch myself waiting, on some irrational level, for her to miss one. She never does. That's the part that stays with you. Not the speed, not even the blindfold, really. It's the accuracy on the target. She almost didn't shoot. The 7th one. The civilian silhouette she held fire on for half a second in the middle of a blind high-speed string, because even faster than her reflexes were, her judgment was faster still. I've since had the chance to review Rosalind's post-graduation deployment record, and I'll tell you briefly, because I think it closes this story the way it deserves to be closed. She was assigned to a joint peacekeeping detachment on a contested border world 18 months after graduation, a posting that saw genuine, sustained, low-intensity conflict, not training exercises. In one incident, a raiding party attempted a night assault on a joint outpost during a total sensor blackout caused by an ion storm. No scopes, no thermal, no light amplification. Nothing but the raw senses every soldier in that outpost was born with. The report notes with the same flat procedural understatement, the coalition applies to everything, that the human element of the detachment repelled the assault with minimal friendly casualties, engaging hostile combatants under conditions of zero visibility. It does not go into further detail, because most incident reports don't need to. But I read between those lines the same way I watched that exam 5 years ago, and I know exactly what that report is actually describing. I know exactly what it looked like when Rosalind Achebe's world went dark and her senses simply did what they had been built over hundreds of thousands of years on a planet that never once let its people stop paying attention to do. The last thing I want to leave you with is something Commandant Threll said to the assembled instructor corps in a briefing that followed a full review of the marksmanship curriculum in the wake of that exam. It wasn't dramatic. Threll isn't a dramatic officer, but it stayed with every instructor who was in that room, and I think it deserves to travel further than that briefing did. She said that the Academy's job was never actually to measure whether a species looked capable on paper. It was to find out what a person could do when you finally stopped deciding for them what they couldn't. And she said that the day we mistake a quiet cadet for a fragile one, the day we rig a test to spare someone a failure they never asked to be spared from, is the day we've stopped teaching entirely and started merely managing our own comfortable assumptions instead. I think about that every time a new intake arrives at this academy. I look at the files now the way I wish I'd looked at Rosalind's file from the beginning, not as a set of numbers that tells me what a species can't do, but as an invitation to actually find out. Because somewhere out there, on a soft green Class 3 world, we filed away as unremarkable a century ago. An entire species spent its whole evolutionary history learning to survive without ever fully trusting its eyes. None of us thought to ask what that might mean until one quiet cadet tied a blindfold over her face and showed us exactly what we'd been too careless to notice. We don't rig the exam anymore. Not for humans, and, if I have anything to say about it, not for anyone else either, because the truth is, I never actually needed to protect her from that range. I needed the range to be protected from underestimating her.